Available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you are enjoying this very basketball heavy show because we are going to stick with this topic before we get into the final segment of today's show, which is a player profile. So without further ado, let's jump into some of my fantasy takeaways from this NBA season. It was a very fascinating, to say the least, fantasy season in the NBA. A lot of different players stepping up, a lot of top level players maintaining their dominance in terms of fantasy, and that is one of the takeaways I want to start off with. Just to the sheer level of production, the top 3 or so players in terms of fantasy in the NBA have produced over the past couple of years, and they're constantly and steadily improving, and they're showing no signs of slowing. Let's start off with Nikola Jokic. I saw the potential in him many years before to be the guy he is now, just because of the way he adapts his style of play. He's continuously evolving. He's always willing to not only score points, but do the dirty work as well. Nikola Jokic averaged a career-high 60.3 ESPN fantasy points per game. And also, Joel Embiid, if he stays healthy, he definitely isn't in the MVP conversation. And then Luka Doncic as well. We saw he had an incredible run, especially in the postseason, leaving it all on the line for his Dallas Mavericks. They were the only ones over 53 points per game. So as you can see, those are the tops stay at the top because they are just willing to just leave everything on the field, on the court, and just produce those numbers that they know they can. And they're definitely going to be hot commodities and going very early, if not number 1 overall in fantasy draft boards. Now, another big storyline from this NBA season in terms of fantasy implications lies in the West. All of the big 4 players in LA stayed healthy. Now, I know that they certainly are kind of waning in terms of production. The LA Lakers. The LA Lakers are not necessarily the hottest team in the league. They're going through some turmoil. And also the Clippers, who look like early on in the year they could contend for the title as well. But when their big 4 stays healthy, they are some of the better fantasy producers just due to the sheer impact that they have in all facets of the game. You know, I feel as if LeBron and AD together, now that, Paul George is now gone to the 76ers, is going to offer a lot more upside than, say, a lonely Kawhi Leonard on the Clippers. But right now, I just feel like health is all the LA teams have going for them. They don't necessarily offer any upside in terms of playoff production. They don't offer any upside in terms of excitement and appeal unless those guys are healthy. If not, then they're in really tough spots. I haven't seen a Lakers team this desperate in many years. And the LA Clippers have always been desperate. And going from looking like one of the more promising leagues to losing Paul George in free agency right now just is a terrible look for them. And it shouldn't matter in terms of fantasy, but I think it will once, LeBron leaves AD in the dust, potentially goes into retirement next year, and Kawhi Leonard's like, you know what, I have to abandon ship in from LA too and get out of here before it all comes crashing down, because while projects are good in terms of fantasy, because you have these guys, all of these guys who can offer you high upside everywhere on the court, it certainly is risky on the court as well, because you have to manage egos, and it's not always pretty. And I certainly think JJ Redick will have a tough task with that, but that's outside of my realm. In terms of fantasy, the Big Four staying healthy was paramount, because a lot of people still like the value that LeBron James brings, and also they know that when Anthony Davis produces and is healthy, he is one of the top 3 fantasy centers, in my humble opinion, in fantasy drafts. And so I think that them maintaining their health was much more important in terms of fantasy than, say, anything going on the court. That being said, let's transition to another player who did not remain as healthy, but we saw flashes of what he could potentially be in terms of fantasy implications next year, just because of his sheer abilities, and that is Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid will always struggle to stay on the court. It's not a question. Joel Embiid will always have his struggles on and off the court. But when he is on the court, he certainly can be one of the best players, not just in the Eastern Conference, but in the entire NBA. 35.3, 11.3, 5.7 stat line, but only in 34 games. And I really think that in order for Joel Embiid to have really any impact in terms of fantasy, he's got to be supplemented with the teammates around him that he knows he needs, and adding Paul George certainly can add to that. There's a lot less pressure on him. And B, I just feel that Joel Embiid needs to stop pushing it so hard. He needs to stop trying to overachieve. Because in all reality, you don't need that much from Joel Embiid. You just need the presence he brings. His presence alone truly confounds opposing NBA defenses. And so Joel Embiid just needs to remain calm and focused on the task at hand. And that is A, maintaining himself, and B, trying to break through in the process. And so I definitely feel like if you do take Joel Embiid, you're definitely not going to be starting him all the time. But when you do, you're going to reap the benefits. And so that's all I'm going to say about Joel Embiid. Let's switch to rookie centers as well, because Victor Wembanyama certainly had a fantastic season. He's looking to be one of the top fantasy players, if not the top fantasy players, next year in the league. But he's not the only one. Chet Holmgren's rise is one to watch out for on a young Oklahoma City Thunder team who punched above its weight in the Western Conference this year. He actually shot better than Wemby. He had a low turnover rate, had 4th round pick draft positioning coming into the season. I think that a lot of people saw his upside but were a little concerned about his length and strength, especially coming off an injury that really made him miss the entirety of what should have been his rookie season. But he exceeded his potential by averaging 41.2 ESPN fantasy points per game and ultimately ending up as a top 30 pick. So as you can see, the hype around Wemby is definitely justified, because Wemby really stepped up his game. We were a little bit worried about him and his size. He lacked the bulk needed and that frame to really be physical in today's NBA, a lot of people were saying. But he really adjusted well. But it kind of got lost, kind of, overshadowed someone who also deserves a lot of credit in that rookie class, or quote unquote rookie class, as he should be a second-year player. But that just goes to show that the league is ever evolving. I'm going to continue to say that because of the fact that big men are becoming more valued, and if you hit on them in the draft, if you really pay into them, they'll pay into the league as well. They'll really focus on improving their game, saying, what can I do to be better? And they will heighten their games to the levels that people want from them. And so, Chet Holmgren is also that guy. The last thing I want to point out is obviously off-season player movement. We've already seen a lot of trades go down. A lot of low-level ones, kind of like the Denny Avdija trade, but also high-profile ones like the Dejounte Murray and now the Paul George trade to the 76ers. And so, I feel like for the teams that either A, trade away someone, or B, move for a trade, there certainly becomes a lot of intrigue in terms of how it affects the other players on the team. Like, for example, Mikal Bridges. I'll throw him out there because he's kind of one of those high-profile trades who's not necessarily, as high-profile as a Paul George. There's not a lot of hype surrounding where he'll end up. But ending up in the Knicks is a very fascinating situation for him. Because now he adds the defensive upside, he adds the length, he adds the depth that the Knicks need. Let's move to Dejounte Murray. He does the same thing for the New Orleans Pelicans. And Paul George for the 76ers, he'll probably start right away. And that adds another power dynamic to the 76ers team that already has, a young guard in Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. So just trying to piece together how these moves will impact your choices in terms of fantasy drafts and who you take, whether or not you're overvaluing someone based off their moves or not, could really impact how you decide to build your squad. But ultimately, no matter which direction you take, I really think there is going to be a lot of volatility in who we see at the top of these rankings. Obviously, you're always going to have your Jokic's and Lukas and Embiid's of the world, but there are a lot of up-and-coming players that will prove their mettle in this league that I'm really intrigued to see in terms of fantasy. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up for the last segment of today's show, we will be looking at Joe Mixon as our fantasy player profile for the day. It should be a fascinating one as he's had an up-and-down career. Moving to a new home in Houston, we will have to see if he will up his production. We'll be right back to see if he can.